This is actually a slide deck that I kind of use sometimes when I don't speak to art audiences, actually, because, so this is why I have this kind of idiotic first slide. But this is a picture of me in front of Kim.com's mansion in New Zealand, the founder of Mega Upload. But anyhow, I'll just get right into this. So I'm going to go through a few projects that I've made over the last, I don't know, 5 years, something like that. The first project I want to talk about is a show that I made in Munich that then traveled, and it was about this tech conference that happens in Munich every year, put on by Hubert Burda since 2005, I think. Whoops, sorry about that. Yikes. There we go. And it's called DLD, and I wanted to do some kind of snapshot of the tech industry at that point. I wanted to make a kind of documentary exhibition which framed a bunch of the key players in that scene at the time and what they were interested in and what they were looking at. And conferences in general, like a big part of tech culture somehow. There's many around the world, and in Europe, DLD is one of the more prominent ones. They have people like that year they had Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook speaking, they had Jack Dorsey from Twitter, they had Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia, I mean like really big important thinkers and whatever, cultural icons of that context. But they also do this huge build out, they do this amazing stage set, and I thought what a cool thing it would be to kind of reflect on this community somehow and repackage them through looking at this one moment, this one kind of snapshot. So that's one of their stage designs, which is kind of like a futuristic alpine scene somehow. Uh-oh. I'm not able to scroll. I don't know what's going on here with the pointer. Sorry, dude. Something crazy going on here. PowerPoint. Also seems to have no relationship to... Okay. Cool. So this is the other stage. So they have two stages simultaneously running at the same time. So that was a futuristic alpine scene. This is kind of like an oldie-timey alpine scene with like taxidermy and beer. Would you believe there? And I was interested in kind of using those design cues as some kind of framing device. And this is a slide by one of the leaders of the sharing economy, Brian Chesky, one of the founders of Airbnb. This is an aesthetic that I also thought had like a nice relationship to what was going on in the talks. And it led me to this kind of whole practice, this graphic practice that I thought would be appropriate for my documentary exhibition called school morphism, which is like where you use kind of objects to kind of stand in, or images of objects to stand in for functions. It's something that's used in interface design since at least the 1970s, most popularly by Apple, of course. And at that conference, everybody was using Apple that year. It was the high point in the iPhone revolution. And yeah, here you have this little meme that I made there. So iOS 5 was the dominant platform at that point, and this was like really like, it didn't get any more skeuomorphic than this. So you had, you know, like a full bookshelf for your books. You had a kind of writing pad for your pads, and I thought that this would be the perfect language to use to describe that community. So I made these canvases, which unfortunately you can't read because of the res, but where I took quotes from each talk and kind of images from each talk. I did a kind of laborious, note of each kind of moment there that I thought was interesting. This is Andrew Mason, the co-founder of Groupon, which at that time was growing year on year at 500% or whatever, and Groupon was kind of an anomaly, one of the unicorns of the time, And yeah, here we have an example of how that canvas looks. So I kind of took the stage background that he was speaking at, kind of made a graphic version of that, and then laid over each kind of relevant text in this handwriting font, which is often used in the kind of note-taking app in iOS 5, and then kind of had these Polaroids with the main speakers on them. So here's a quote typical of that talk. Let's start having fun, let's get funky, let's announce everything, let's be wildly positive in our forecasts, let's take this thing to the extreme. If we get whacked on the ride down, who gives a shit? The time to get radical is now, we have nothing to lose. So this is the kind of amazing momentum that was happening in the tech industry in 2012. This is another kind of different side of the tech industry. This is obviously Jimmy Wales speaking to the Russian entrepreneur Pavel Durov, who at that time had vKontakte, which is the kind of Russian version of Facebook somehow. He had to then later on sell that company to the state and flee Russia. But at that point he was riding high, and he actually donated, at that moment they had donated $1 million to Wikipedia on stage, which was also like a highlight from the event. So that was the kind of things that was going on there. He had a nice slide that Pavel Durov put together, the greed axis, with like different apps and how he felt that they were altruistic or greedy on a kind of a timeline. So I made these, I made this this whole group of talks. I made one panel for every talk. So there was 90 talks over 3 days, and so I made 90 panels, and you kind of walk through this timeline that I made, which is a kind of a maze, a little bit like lining up at the bank or something, like a stanchion arrangement, where you kind of go from each panel to panel, and there's an overwhelming amount of information. There's like a lot of, it's quite an interesting scale, because those things are kind of A0, so it's very kind of human-sized. You're looking these people in the eye. Yeah, you really get the sense of what I felt was like the feeling of being at this conference. They were also all forward-facing, so the canvases were only visible in terms of their content from the front. And so as you kind of made your way through the timeline, when you looked back, there was just no content, which I thought was like a nice thing. Timeline obviously is one of the most important organizing tools of the dominant platforms of that moment, Facebook and Twitter. So I thought that to make that sculpture was again reinforcing that community. Here it is in New Zealand, it traveled. Here it is in New York. Yeah, and then I made this this kind of Venn diagram of what I thought the most interesting parts of that approach was. So it's kind of tech conferences. Oops, sorry about that. It's tech conferences and participants meets kind of documentary exhibition making, meets kind of mobile interface design, and comes together as a kind of snapshot of the tech industry. The next project I want to talk about is something I did in Berlin at Gallery Buchholz in 2013-14, which was an interesting moment also in Berlin. The same community. Berlin is and was kind of coming to reimagine itself as a tech hub, like a kind of many cities want to reimagine themselves as the next Silicon Valley, and Germany was trying to become that, or Berlin was trying to become that for Germany. Here's a building that's being rebuilt or was being rebuilt then, which is now a prominent incubator where a lot of young companies kind of go to a group of startups together in a building. Here a great Mozilla advertisement on the side, a kind of don't be evil type message there. This is another conference that happened in Berlin, High Berlin, which is owned by Axel Springer, another publishing company there. This is a more kind of grassrootsy style event, Tech Open Air. So again, conferences of different sizes and flavors were very important on the calendar there. Techcrunch Disrupt came to Berlin that year. Now, for those of you not familiar with Silicon Valley, Techcrunch is like probably the most known blog for this community. That all of the, a lot of the dominant conversations pass through that blog at some point in Silicon Valley. And they do this event called Disrupt, which is again like a conference. And Berlin was so important to them at that point that they thought it was kind of on the up. So they thought it worth doing one there. Now they moved it to London, actually. But I thought, like, how do I kind of make a sculptural picture again of a community like this and of a city reimagining itself? And I was looking at the time at like competitive gaming culture, and I really loved these kind of what they call case mods. So if you're like a competitive gamer, maybe some of you are, some people in that community like to make kind of badass looking cases with like all the best tech and kind of really express yourself in terms of how your computer looked. And I wanted to kind of make a case mod for each of the top 10 startups in Berlin. So here's that exhibition, and here's a couple of the top 10 startups and the case mods I made for them. They're the banner from Techcrunch Disrupt. You get a real idea of how the city was also kind of used as a backdrop here. So you have this kind of exploding image behind the Brandenburger Tor with Disrupt kind of passing through it. This is a case mod for IM, which is a kind of image sharing platform that when it first started was a little bit resembling something like Instagram, but now has pivoted towards being a user-generated stock imagery selling platform. I made this case out of a kind of mirror reflective glass. So I was kind of thinking of these as, on the one hand, a sort of monument to each of these top 10 startups as they were emerging, but also as a kind of a little miniature possible headquarters space. And I wanted to make a kind of how would you say it, a kind of a cityscape in the gallery. So this is the kind of off-the-shelf material that you can get if you're in the case modding context, and that's how I kind of branded it for IM. This is Sociomantic, another company, one of the top 10 there. ROI, return on investment, very important for them. The Innovators Dilemma, so I also blew up these kind of book covers and key diagrams from kind of tech culture and had it on these these kind of construction fences that were kind of popping up around Berlin. So like important text which informed the way that these companies bring themselves together and imagine themselves. The Innovators Dilemma was the space where the word disrupt was first used to describe a disruptive business. So for those of you that don't know, a disruptive business will come in and kind of completely change the market. So Apple and the iPhone is like a key, like a clear example of what disruption is. So it's the cell phone market. It was completely kind of irrelevant after they released that product. So that disrupted the cell phone market. Here you have Clue, the only female-founded tech company in the top 10 that year. Gender balance is not something which is very well represented in tech culture in Berlin or anywhere else. And here's that, to give you a sense of scale, here's that, that banner from the building of the factory on the wall among these other key cases. SoundCloud being the most known Berlin-founded, Berlin-based company, I guess. So here we have my Venn diagram again. Young companies in Berlin, SoundCloud, the factory, IM, etc. meet the idea of disruptive innovation from Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovators Dilemma, and then a kind of Berlin rebranding exercise comes together to form a disruptive ecosystem. This is another project I did at Politicus in Frankfurt about a slightly older tech company, but a very dominant and important one from a very different context. This is about the South Korean giant Samsung, and I have been a fan of Samsung for a long time. I've always worked with Samsung equipment when I make exhibitions, and I think they have done some incredible work in the area of making excellent screens. This is an image that I used for a poster, which is from one of their prospectuses. But this is the CEO of the company, the chairman of the company, Lee Kun-hee. And I read this amazing Business Week article about a moment in the kind of a turning point in the culture of Samsung and their management practices. And I thought it was the most amazing thing that I'd ever heard. In '93, this is when Samsung wasn't such a known international brand. Lee Kun-hee flew all of his major shareholders, directors, executives over to Frankfurt, all the way from Seoul, to a hotel where he did something called the Frankfurt Declaration, which was like a kind of a meeting, but also a kind of press event where he completely changed the company's practices, and it became kind of memorialized by the company as like the turning point in their history. This is the hotel which it took place in near the airport in Frankfurt. These are key texts that came out of it. Lee Kun-hee's book, this translates to something along the lines of change yourselves first, or something like that. And here's a cartoon version of the new management philosophy, which was made at that time. And here's some translations I had made of these comics from within those texts. So here's an amazing kind of excerpt where Samsung is depicted as a little bunny, and the kind of international markets that it wants to kind of participate in are depicted as a kind of ferocious jungle members. And they kind of, Samsung then has to kind of man up a little bit and be strong to go out in the world and take on giants like Sony, Honda, Toyota, and General Motors. Yeah, they also used a lot of military kind of metaphors for that as well. Yeah, there's an old saying, if you know your enemy and yourself, you can win every battle. And here it is, the Samsung kind of general taking on NAFTA, the EU, the ASEAN, these kind of things that were very dominant in the world of commerce, according to Samsung, in the early 90s. That's a kind of fantasy image I made of a memorial that was to the Frankfurt Declaration that is supposedly in this training center in Yongjin. So Lee Kun-hee and his group at Samsung bought the kind of full interior of the meeting room that was in that hotel room and kind of set it up as a kind of a memorial sculpture somehow, which is in this training center. And it's a very secret space, you can't enter it, and I wanted to kind of make a kind of pirate version of this most important cultural monument of Samsung. This is a plaque which I did some research with and supposedly was produced during that period as well. Change begins with me, the key quote coming from Lee Kun-hee for that. And here's my version of this memorial. So you have this Canaletto painting, or a copy of a Canaletto painting, in front of a chair printed with the image of Lee Kun-hee at the meeting. And then I wanted to put a kind of double-sided mirror on itself of this kind of monument to kind of complete a circle of new management speculation. And I then also installed a kind of pavilion wall with Samsung air conditioning units with quotes from the new management as well. So when a group has changed, a society can be changed. And during the exhibition, these kind of run and circulate air coming from the material around the exhibition. Yeah, here you get a little glimpse of that. Timeline with the Frankfurt Declaration in from Samsung's own history hall. A memorial group of things I saved from my trip to South Korea. Yeah, the Burj Khalifa, which Samsung Group are very proud of and also built. And then this kind of important timeline of phones, which describe the success from that moment of turning point right up until the Galaxy, which was, of course, and is one of the leading phones in the industry. Here, a kind of another excerpt from that comic on a vitrine, and there from above in the porticus. So new management kind of took Samsung and Lee Kun-hee's new management principle, mixed it with Kempinski Hotel, Gravenbrook, and a kind of international expansionary dream of global markets. And there in the middle is the new management monument copy. This relating to the first image and a show that I did here in Vienna some time ago. Kim.com, the founder of Mega Upload. I'm from New Zealand, and Kim is also will be maybe based in New Zealand. He founded this sharing platform, basically a file sharing platform and internet video hosting space called Mega and Mega Upload and Mega Video, which was at 1.4% of the whole internet's traffic. So it was a ginormous thing. And he was targeted by the US, and there was a huge raid on his house in January of 2012. This is the cover of the indictment sheet that was generated from the US courts, and the New Zealand police, kind of in a kind of weird or unusual complicity with a foreign body, kind of collaborated with the FBI on this crazy raid on his mansion. So here's an image from the helicopter of the raids on the mansion. Kim lived in the most expensive house in the country at that point, and he kind of had this bad boy, I don't know, like badass image, where he lived large with lots of cars and all sorts of things. This is the New Zealand police breaking into his house. Just to give you a bit of context, New Zealand police don't carry guns usually. This is an incredibly unusual experience, and it's clearly more about like staging a fantasy than any kind of necessary force in this situation. This is the indictment list of the group of things that were taken off Kim in the seizure. There were 110 items taken off Kim, and when I first saw this published, I was kind of like convinced that it was a very interesting proposition for a group of things to stand in for the conversation around Kim. So I wanted to make an exhibition again around like these issues that Kim kind of stood for: who has sovereignty in what states, what is privacy in a space like today, and what is copyright in a moment like today. All these issues which kind of swelled so poignantly around that narrative, so carefully framed by the US authorities. But yeah, he had like 64 bank accounts on this list seized or something like this, and a number of pieces of hardware like TVs and things like that, but also artworks. So there was like an idea that it was a real kind of a collection, like a list of a collection. And I like to think about this, and I thought about this, as a kind of a collaboration between Kim and the US courts, in a certain sense, as a curatorial project. And this was kind of a list of a possible curated space of Kim's collection. And here is some of the New Zealand contractors removing one of the artworks that Kim had in his collection, Colin Christian sculpture. Here his giant TV and a predator statue that Kim also kept and was indicted with. Here Kim's, it appearing in the New Zealand papers. He appeared in the New Zealand papers probably for about a year, and even longer, every day on the front cover. It was this ginormous thing in New Zealand, and I contrasted the mainstream media's depiction of him with Kim's own tweeting practice, which got very visible as well. So I painted these little tweets on that as part of the exhibition as well. He also started a political party at one point. I won't go into that, but that's a very interesting chapter. I made a kind of a plaque for each of these items so that one could visualize them as a group without having the actual objects in the space. So this is an example of the plaque I designed for his URLs that were taken. Mega video clips, mega porn. I made this exhibition in many different places and many different scales. This image and these plaques are kind of A6 at the MUMOC. When I toured it to New Zealand, I made them kind of A0, and they're here again, the show in the MUMOC. I tried to get kind of copies or stand-ins or versions of the work that Kim had in his collection, plus some of the hardware, plus I tried to open a number of bank accounts to really kind of create a sort of surrogate group of things from the list to stand in for these objects. Here in Colchester in England, we were able to get kind of full-scale, like what I would like to call kind of 100% resolution versions of these objects. Other times it wasn't possible when we were only able to get kind of smaller versions of things. So this Colin Christian sculpture that we borrowed is much smaller than the ones owned by Kim, for example. But here we were able to get like a full-scale actual version of two of the many Mercedes that were on that list, and a different stand-in for the Predator. Here's Kim in his gaming room right before the raid with a mural that he had commissioned by a group that I then got in touch with when I made the exhibition in New Zealand. I asked them to kind of repeat that as well, to kind of add a bit of depth to the collection in New Zealand. They also kind of pulled out parts of that mural and painted it over my labels. So you had this kind of even further dramatized version. Kim was actually the leading player in the world at Call of Duty at that point, and he was the #1 on the planet. So, but quite an amazing poetry in the fact that these images somehow also represented that raid. Yeah. Kim Sidhu, another Colin Christian sculpture. A different view of that exhibition. 175 million US dollars in cash, which I borrowed from New Zealand Reserve Bank in shredded currency. Here's a bunch of bank accounts I tried to open in all of the different banks that he was working with. A long paper trail with no success, and a number of the personalized number plates that he had for his collection. So. Great sense of humor. So here, documentary exhibition making comes into contact with the US court's assessment of valuable objects and an entrepreneur's collection to make a kind of US court as curator experience. TEDx Vaduz. This is a project I did with the artist Daniel Keller and Emily Seagull. I was offered to do an exhibition at the museum in Liechtenstein, and I was thinking of like having some kind of direct interaction with TED, because TED is probably a little bit like DLD, maybe even more important than DLD in this kind of development of tech conference culture. They're probably the most recognized brand in the tech conference space, and they're a very premium brand. And since 2009, they've been going since the 80s, but since 2009 they kind of license out their brand to different people in different countries to do like self-organized versions of the same thing. Since there'd never been a TED in Liechtenstein, I thought it would be a great thing to do TEDx Vaduz. Liechtenstein, I thought, was like a very interesting context to do a TED talk at that point, because many of the voices that I was following in Silicon Valley were thinking about ideas of moving outside of general society and creating separate societies. An idea of outside, an idea of kind of offshore seasteading culture, where they would kind of go and live all on a boat in international waters and kind of create a whole new country where they wouldn't have to kind of participate in the systems which sometimes get in the way of innovation in those cultures. So people like Larry Page were talking about this very visibly at the Google I/O, and Peter Fend is not Peter Fend. He's later on to speak about this, but he's Peter Thiel, another VC from Silicon Valley, is a seasteading fan. This is a scene I took outside of a bus stop in Liechtenstein. So Liechtenstein, of course, has been known for being an offshore tax haven, or has been described like that. So I thought overlaying the kind of exit impulses of people from Silicon Valley, or the ideals from Silicon Valley as represented by TED, onto a country or a principality which is known for a kind of outside was an interesting idea. So here's me and Dan. We applied for and received the official license from TED to do TEDx Vaduz, and there's many different kind of guidelines that you have to follow when you do a TEDx, but actually stage design is not particularly overseen. So we took a lot of edge with our stage design. Here's a tag cloud Dan did of all of the kind of most said words ever in a TED talk. So think, thank, and thing come up top. And then we also did a kind of stage with Liechtenstein rendered as a kind of tropical island to get this kind of offshore thing even more. As for those of you that don't know, but everybody here probably does, Liechtenstein is quadruple landlocked, so it couldn't be further from the geographical truth. Here's Emily Seagull giving her talk on luxury, the changing face of luxury. Here's Femke Herregraven doing a talk on her research into the offshore networks that takes your money around the world. She invented this amazing game where you can kind of go through and get for each country the best outcome for your money. Here's Peter Fend, who designed a kind of a different taxing system based on land use, better land use in Vaduz. And here's an exhibition I made of the show with artworks of the artists that spoke. So here's Katja Novitskova's piece. She was speaking also about the ecology online. And I also made these kind of little atmosphere memorial groups. This is for Femke's talk on the offshore world. And I iced I iced a cake, a commemorative cake, for the center, for the heart of this, with the successful TED application on it. So each of these had that and a reproduction of the stage. Here's some great drawings Peter Fendt had in the show. Yeah, and here's my Venn diagram here. The idea of exit and seasteading, new outside societies and frontierism in Silicon Valley meets TED Talks as a standard for Silicon Valley idea spreading, and Liechtenstein as a quadruple landlocked principality known for offshore and tax haven. Yeah, the final project I'm going to talk about tonight is part of what is represented here in the group exhibition. Yeah, as many of you will know, this image and this website, this is the Guardian's website at the moment, yeah, when they kind of repackaged these first Edward Snowden leaks from the NSA. So this is, I think, maybe one of the first slides, if not the first slide group that was released by Snowden in collaboration with a number of journalists. Yeah, I mean, like everybody in the world at that point, I was just completely floored by the experience of looking through this kind of relic of office culture and communication within the NSA and within the Five Eyes, as they're known, intelligence community, of which New Zealand is a part. And I was particularly interested in the way that they used, I mean, obviously I was interested in what was going on, and there was amazing kind of journalistic work and artistic work done around how these programs were being made and what was being done, and all the crazy stuff that we didn't realize that these types of people had access to, and systems that were going on. But I was particularly interested in the way that that these programs were imaged. The kind of the logos that were used, to me, were very surprising. The language that was being used, it was kind of like a cartoony, kind of jovial thing, which kind of seemed at odds with these programs, which seemed very serious and yeah, very scary. Here's a few highlights from some of the logos. Oops. Yeah, here's probably one of the best ones. This is for Mystic, which is like a kind of a kind of a wizard with a staff with a kind of cell phone on it, and the SSO, Special Source Operations logo, which is a kind of giant eagle carrying the Earth in its talons. So it has these kind of cables which it literally carries the Earth on. And I was just thought that it was such an amazing group of things that I wanted to kind of present those images as a kind of monument to this world through kind of reinterpreting and blowing up the kind of all of the key and exciting images I found in there. So here's exactly that wizard and this kind of eagle taxidermied. And I placed this in the Marchana Library in the middle of Venice, and we used the Marchana as the New Zealand pavilion for that year. Marchana Library is a kind of a very well-known building and one of the most important buildings in St. Mark's Square, designed by Sansovino, but also it has a lot of images in it, painted, beautiful paintings from Titian and Veronese and other kind of masters of the time. The whole building is kind of considered to be some kind of allegory for the value of acquiring and keeping knowledge. And each of these kind of paintings are sort of an image of that as well, commissioned by the state, obviously, at that time. And there's also a number of old maps and kind of beautiful globes made in that period as well. So I kind of thought that a kind of dialogue between ways that intelligence imagery and geopolitical imagery is produced and used today by a state, contrasted with that of a different state's kind of similar imagery in a way, would be a kind of amazing experience to kind of try and contextualize some of what was going on in the Snowden work. So here's some details from that. Poison Nut, a VPN program which tracks people using VPN. This is the logo for that. A kind of, you can't really see that, but it's a kind of a squirrel kind of shrieking and recoiling back from this kind of nut, and I was like, when I was looking at all this material, I was thinking, who are the people that design this stuff? Like, who are the artists tasked with making these images? What is the role of these designers? And why do they choose this kind of group of imagery? And as I was doing that research, I came across this guy. I came across David Dachicourt on his LinkedIn profile, and he was the creative director for defense intelligence at the National Security Agency for the 10 years from 2001 to 2012. So right in that period when a lot of this material was being developed. Yeah, here's a few excerpts from his profile. His work was instrumental in communicating the NSA mission, vision, and projects in brochures, flyers, posters, maps, exhibit displays, newsletters, banners, signs, presentations, and promotional pieces. And he was also, responsible for complex senior-level visual communications initiatives throughout the agency and the intel community. So I thought, here's a very likely key to this kind of potential artist figure. And so I made a kind of monument. Half of the room was kind of dedicated to excerpts from the Snowden slides, which I thought were particularly poignant. And half the room was kind of dedicated to this artist figure as a kind of a hero of that group. This is a self-portrait that he did of himself, which I kind of redrew and blew up to scale. And here you have him in the Marchana Library kind of in conversation with these philosophers on the wall. So them with their kind of books and him with his Mac Pro. Here's some work from his Behance profile, like a kind of profile online where you kind of put work that you want people to see so that you get hired to do other jobs. So he's now a freelance designer. And this is some excerpts from work that he'd done, exhibition design that he'd done for the NSA's own public-facing museum, the National Cryptographic Museum, and some cartoon work that he'd done there for kids called the Crypto Kids. So this is a kind of a group of cartoons which introduce children to the way that the NSA do their work. I did little miniature versions of these exhibition designs, and I did full redrawings of some of the Crypto Kids. But I also engaged in a kind of commission with Dachicourt. So I kind of surreptitiously commissioned 2 pieces for the exhibition directly from him through his profile, and this is one of them, a New Zealand kind of version of one of the Crypto Kids. I wanted him to follow all of these amazing images that he put up there in the style of that. This is a counterintelligence awareness poster that he designed for the NSA. This is a mouse pad that he designed for the NSA. This is a security poster that he designed again. And I kind of put those also, gave them the same treatment as all of the Snowden material. So here you get this amazing blue-eyed knight and some of these technical diagrams in a monument. Here, a management strategy that is used in the Department of Defense a lot from Patrick Lencioni. And then also some work that he'd done after the NSA. So after the NSA, he'd gone on to work for different people and do different things. This is dive into social networking, a kind of a game for kids which tells you of the dangers of oversharing on social networks, and Positive Press, which is like a board game also, which is designed to keep people in an upbeat space. But again, I found it amazing that the kind of same language was used for this material as was for much of the kind of work of the NSA. This is the British intelligence slide group, The Art of Deception, which is all about human intelligence, where you kind of do, human cyber humming, as they call it. This is the vitrine that was produced out of that. A number of things which kind of came as a kind of main strain of these aesthetic practices was that wizards came up a lot. Different wise bearded men, wizards, things from a gaming background, from a kind of trickery background. There was a lot of cards represented. There was a lot of different kind of military groups and also classic sociological things that are used in management. Here a blow up tank, which was used alongside a kind of an image of a magician that supposedly went to work for the British intelligence at one point. Another really interesting group of slides for a program which is called Treasure Map, which is kind of like the NSA's version of Google Earth, and they used a Terminator skull as the kind of as the seal for that program, which I thought was also incredible. So here you have an artist, somebody like Dachicourt, if not Dachicourt himself, choosing to use an image which is like associated in popular culture with the Terminator and the dangers of using AI as a kind of military tool, used as a kind of as the logo for a program which potentially does exactly that. A very interesting choice there. But yeah, here's a few more images of the show. Here you have a little bit of an idea of those globes, celestial globe with a lot of like animals on it as well. And here the other commission that I got Dachicourt to do, a kind of map of New Zealand. Yeah, the ceiling imagery, each an allegorical painting for a different moment of knowledge. I also did a huge advertisement piece for my exhibition in the airport, where I kind of made a one-to-one photo of the entire space of all of those images that are used or that were painted to represent the value of knowledge and the value of keeping knowledge, and put them all over the arrivals areas in the Marco Polo airport. And here is Titian's wisdom sitting on a cloud. With behind here is where you get interrogated if you get pulled aside on your way through the airport. So that was a kind of an intro to that. So Secret Power is a kind of geographical, political intelligence visualizations from different moments, mixed with the Marchana Library as an allegory for the value of knowledge, mixed with Edward Snowden leaked NSA graphics and slides, mixed with graphic emblems and intelligence programs, and the Fra Mauro, Titian, and Corelli, and Sansovino, and at the center, David Dachicourt as the kind of case study of an artist in that figure. Thanks very much for listening.